It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Harold Perkin, who's made an important contribution to the development of social history in Britain over a good many years. Harold, since we're both social historians, I think we should begin by putting you in your social context. Can you tell us about your early background, where you grew up, for example?
I was born in the Potteries, in a little terrace house, 2 up, 2 down, within 100 yards of the Theatre Royal. In fact, when I was born, they fetched the doctor out of the theatre when they were playing Romana. If I'd been a girl, I'd have been called Romana. I belonged to a family which stretched from very ordinary workers at one end through artists, painters, paintresses and managers, to master potters at the other end who owned 13 factories, 13 small factories, which they later replaced with 4 very large ones. So from the very beginning, I had a notion of inequality, of the range of society. So I had a sort of built-in interest in the history of society and why some people were rich and some poor, and so on.
What did your own father do?
He was a sort of building foreman. He ran a little building firm which built houses and did repairs. When he finally left it in the late 30s, the firm went bankrupt within 12 months, and that served them right for firing him, I think.
Did you have any direct experience of the Depression in the 30s, or were you fairly insulated from it?
Well, we were a little bit insulated. Many of our relations were on 3 days a week in the Potteries at that time. We had relations working for Doulton and Wedgwood and well-known names of that kind. But the building industry was not exactly thriving, but it was certainly, over 4,000 houses were built between the wars, and so my father was never unemployed. And
you must still have been at school during the war.
Yes, I went to the grammar school just before the war, 1938, won an 11+ scholarship, and I spent all of the war, just all of the war, in that grammar school, and got a scholarship to Cambridge just at the end of it. I was a clever little lad, as in those days. I found that winning prizes was very, very easy. I won my first prize at the age of 4 or 5, I think. It was a £1 block of Cadbury's milk chocolate.
Oh, what did you do to get that?
I can't remember what I did, but I know it was the best prize I ever won. It was an exciting time, the war, because the Beveridge Report came out. That was another, track into social
What do you remember
policy.
of that? Since
I
you
remember.
were still a teenager?
I remember it very well because I was also the chairman of a youth club, since there were so few lecturers about, the WA, with which I had connections, asked me to go lecturing to other youth clubs about the Beveridge Report. So I did know a good deal about it. And then I was elected to the committee, the sort of steering committee for a great youth congress in the Potteries, Stoke-on-Trent, in 1944, and I was elected from that to be president. It was a congress on post-war reconstruction, so it was very much about Beveridge.
Were there many
policy.
of these things going on during the war?
I expect there
young
were,
people,
but this was the only
know.
one I knew about in the Potteries, and a young woman named Joan Griffiths was elected secretary of that congress, and that's how I met my wife at 17.
Excellent, good. Then, after school, as you said, you went to Cambridge to read history. Do you have any very inspirational tutors, or anyone who you found stimulating, interesting?
My main supervisor was Charles Wilson, and he was a great business historian, there's no doubt about it. But I think I was a great disappointment to him. I made the mistake, I did make mistakes quite often. I always thought that if you did good work, you'd be recognized and that was it. But I didn't realize the force of patronage, which I came to use as a concept later, as you very well know. And finding the right patron was essential. And I made a great mistake in my final year of not doing a special subject with John Habakkuk, Sir John, of later great fame. But it was a special subject on straight economic history, British economic growth from 1870 to 1930. And I thought it was boring. I didn't actually ever meet him at that point because I stood in the queue outside his room waiting to sign up for his special subject and asked myself, what am I doing here? You know, I'm interested in people. I'm a people man. And so I went off and did a special subject on the Regency period with Reggie White, who was a great man, but not in the fashion at that time. But you see, the Regency period is a central period of change in the Industrial Revolution, and this with, you know, with the radical politics and Peterloo and all that kind of thing. That gave me a great interest in the social side of things.
You moved from being an extramural tutor to being a lecturer in social history in Manchester.
Well, that year in Holyrood College was a disaster because the warden was a very strange man. He was very jolly. He was good at running parties, but an academic he was not. And he objected to my going off to the university. I thought of taking a master's degree in philosophy at that time, on the Benthamites, which was again, you know, very much connected with my interests. And he said, it's unheard of for a young man in his first job to want to do a graduate degree. So you can see that I had to get out of that, and I actually resigned before I got another job. I worked the year out, but this job, it was the first assistant lectureship in social history in the country. It was part of the Clapham money, the Clapham Committee, a subcommittee of the UGC, University Grants Committee, at that time. And Sir John Clapham recommended that there should be a lot more money put into social sciences. Well, that was another eye-opener into the way the world works, because the people in situ, and particularly Arthur Redford, who was my boss, the professor of economic history, he managed to get 3 jobs out of the Clapham money. And mine was the sort of pennyweight, you know, the throw-in. And to his great surprise, he got it. He didn't think much of social history. He thought that social history was economic history with the hard bits left out.
Lots of people think that.
But anyway, I had to develop the first lecture courses in,
what did you teach?
in social
what
history.
was social history then? Or what
well,
did you invent
I
at
had
that point?
2 courses to teach. One was from 1500 to, what was it, 1850? And one was from 1850 to 1950. And I decided quite early on that Trevelyan, you know, history of the politics left out wasn't good enough, and that social history was really the history of society. It was the history of social structure, and it was not, you know, Sunday tea time history as it was thought of before this. It was a type of history which I called it tertiary history. You had to know the political and economic history pretty thoroughly before you could do this, and that's how I treated it. I treated it as social structure. I was interested in, you know, the development of class, and of course social policy, and I didn't leave out the other, what shall we say, the decorative bits. In fact, I was giving a WA course on fashion and society, because I reckoned that you couldn't understand anything, either food or buildings or drink or furniture or clothing, without understanding society. And so I showed, you know, what clothes told you about the past, about past social structure and so on.
What did you use for teaching materials? Because there can't have been much written in many of these fields at this time.
There wasn't very much, and it was a very great problem. It was a question of taking bits from different books, you know. Fortunately, students in those days were willing to use books and to, you know, take bits from various books. They were not like American students who demand a textbook. You must have a textbook, and only one if they can possibly get away with it.
What were the students like in Manchester at that time?
Well, they were very lively. I was very young. I got to know some of them. I'm still friendly with my first student, whom I met at the bus stop my first morning. He's retired now, although he does do some part-time teaching at what is now grandly called the University of Westminster.
Oh, of course. Oh. What about the departments in Manchester at that point? I mean, did they still think what you were doing was a kind of optional extra and not very serious?
Yes, very much so. And with the result that I spent a lot more time with the social scientists. They didn't have sociology so-called at Manchester. They had social anthropology. Gluckman was the professor. But also the economists and so on. I went to their seminars. And they were
in those days you could understand what they said, presumably.
Yeah, well, I could understand what they said, but they were interested in my approach because they were interested in the meaning of the Industrial Revolution, whereas they complained that the economic historians were only interested in bloody steam engines.
Well, perhaps we could move on to look at your scholarly work. And your first major book, The Origins of Modern English Society, came out in 1969.
1969, very late, yes.
Yes, I mean, 2 points strike me about this. It is relatively late.
Well, there are very good reasons for this. I mean, one was the AUT, one was the fact that I went to university, one was the fact that I was doing television at that time. I did a lot of television work for Granada. In fact, it was much cheaper to get me in than to send a camera crew out, you know, to the scene of the crime, as it were. So why
did they bring you in? On what sort of
Well, they brought me in on anything that was happening. You know, the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, you know, the great Khrushchev denunciation of Stalin, the Cuba crisis, the French referendum on the Constitution, all sorts of things. And, the budget, I'd give a sort of rundown on the history of budgets, you know, with cartoons and things like that, you see. So I was doing a lot of that, and then I had my own series. I had a series on the age of the railway and a sequel on the age of the automobile, out of which I wrote a couple of books, as you probably know, popular books, which again were not on, you know, they're not railway buffs books or car buffs books. They're about the impact of communications on society in general. So, again, it was grist to the mill.
And as you mentioned before, your books have been synthesising interpretative works.
Yes.
You haven't written a kind of research-based monograph that historians classically are supposed to
I've done a little bit of that. You know, I did a lot of work on Victorian land reform, and I did the history of Glossop, which was one of which I cut my teeth on. So I've done my archival apprenticeship, as it were, but you're quite right, I'm much more interested in interpretation and synthesis. And this is because, as I said before, I'm interested in what makes the world as it is. And I actually not only looked at the rise of the tripartite class system during the Industrial Revolution, which is what The Origins is about, but I discovered the role of a class which nobody else or very few other people had noticed, which I call the forgotten middle class, which of course is the professional class. And they were the class, you know, the class of teachers, educators, journalists, professional men generally, who played an enormous role in social reform. You know, the doctors who were responsible for the public health movement and all that kind of thing. And doctors like Kay Shuttleworth in education, you see. And it also struck me that they played a very central role because they developed the concepts of class. They were the forgotten middle class because they forgot themselves.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they left themselves out of their tripartite systems, you see. You know, Marx and Ricardo were talking about capitalists, landlords, capitalists and labourers. Carlyle was talking about workers, master workers and master unworkers. Matthew Arnold was talking about the barbarians and the Philistines and the populace. They always had this tripartite system. There was no place in it for themselves. They were above the battle. They were not in the struggle for income.
They were the observers.
They were
outside.
patrician observers, you know, and of course this was very misleading. I mean, I thought they were very interesting people, but I think they were in some ways very arrogant, and they knew what was good for society. They were like doctors, you know. They were sort of treating the rest of society as patients.
Yes, I mean, more than observers,
Yes.
they were trying to change things.
They were trying to change things too. They were trying to make things better. I mean, it was rather like a priest or a doctor or a lawyer. They were trying to do things for people.
They weren't all men, of course. I mean, there were a lot of very active female reformers. Do you think you paid enough attention to...
Well, I've often been accused of not paying enough attention to women, but I think that in my scheme of things, you see, pre-industrial society was dominated by landlords. Industrial society is obviously dominated by capitalists, by industrialists, but also by landlords who catch that boat, you know, who open mines and benefit from town property and so on. But modern society is dominated by professional experts, by human capital. Now, women were, as it were, screwed in those previous societies because they were very rarely, there were exceptions, but they were very rarely allowed to be landlords because, you know, they didn't fight, they hadn't got the feudal qualifications out of which that system grew. They were very rarely allowed to be industrialists unless they were the daughter or something, and even then it wasn't expected of them, a few exceptional ones. But in modern society, once you admit that women have got brains, how can you keep them out? And why should you keep them out? I mean, here's a human resource, the most important resource we have, far more important than fuel or coal or minerals or anything of that sort. And it seems to me that this is the first society in which women have a real claim to play a leading role. And this is far more important than the feminist movement, because there's always been a feminist movement. There have always been women. There have been blue stockings. There have been, reformers, suffragettes, suffragists. But it's only in this kind of society that they've really had their opportunity. So this is my approach to the women's movement. Of course, my wife, Joan Perkin, is very much a feminist and a women's historian. But
well, the prototypes of the professional women
Yes.
of the 20th century, the ladies bountiful, like
Yes,
your sister
yes,
of the 19th,
yes.
the women who were very active in
Yes.
public, very energetic reformers, often politically active, but unpaid for what they were doing. 'Cause
yes, of
society
course, and
didn't-
that was always their role. They were always unpaid. You know, lady comes from the Anglo-Saxon for loaf giver.
I didn't actually know that.
And that was always their role. They gave out soup and blankets. And it was a very important role. It was a nurturing role, but it was not a directing role. It was not a leading role. And it seems to me that they can have this. Now, of course, they haven't got what they deserve. I mean, we're still in a society which is unequal, in which we haven't really got equal pay. We certainly haven't got equal opportunity. There are still glass ceilings, as you will very well know. But it does seem to me that this is the first society which, in principle at any rate, has been able to offer them just desserts.
So from the beginning, when you set out to write the origins, you were conscious of the professions as...
Well,
a
I was not
group to
only conscious
concentrate
of
on.
it. The first proposal, the first outline of the book to Routledge's and King and Paul around 1960 was called The Rise of Professional Society.
Oh, the book you wrote
And it was going to
sometime
be a two-volume work, you see, or at least it turned into a two-volume work, and I decided to call the first volume The Origins of Modern English Society. The second volume, as you know, has now seen daylight and is called The Rise of Professional Society, England, since 1880. And when I talked about the origins of modern English society, I only meant the origins. I didn't mean that, that we were still in Victorian class society. And I left it open at the last paragraph of that book. It does look forward to a second book,
Yes.
in which modern society, as we now know it, which at that time was hardly known. I mean, I'd worked out these ideas long before Daniel Bell, on post-industrial society, or Gary Becker on human capital, or Alvin Goldner on the new class and the intellectuals, All those things did come later, and they were very much grist to my mill, and I was very grateful for them. But I can still show documentary proof that I'd worked out these ideas before this.
Did you see yourself as working within any tradition of historical writing, or did you see yourself as starting something new?
I think I saw myself as starting something new. I mean, I greatly admired Tawney, whom I think worked out notions about professional society, in the 1920s. But I only came upon that later, when I went looking for it, in a sense.
Do you think unconsciously you may have been influenced by people like
Yes, I was influenced by all sorts of people, and it's very difficult to pin down. But I was always very independent. I've never been a joiner. I don't, I've never been very good at networking. I think this was a great mistake in my career. That if I'd networked, if I'd belonged to the left or the right or some other movement, I might have, been more recognized than I am. But the fact is that I've been considered to be a right-winger by the left and a left-winger by the right. I've been sued for libel by the Institute of Economic Affairs, which I think is a great accolade.
Absolutely. What did you do to deserve that?
Oh, I reviewed one of their books, which was called The Long Debate on Poverty, and I said it was only half a loaf. And I said this was a new political movement, and they said they were not party political, which I never did say. But in any case, in the end, we won, I and the Manchester Guardian at that time.
They actually brought a case?
Oh, they actually brought a case, yes, but they settled out of court in the end, and they paid all our costs. But nevertheless, it's quite a feather in my cap, I think.
I was going to say that the Origins came out in 1969, which was the beginning of the period in which Marxist or quasi-Marxist influences on the growth of social history were very strong indeed.
Very strong, yes.
And yours is definitely a non-Marxist analysis of modern English society.
Yes. I got the most terrible review in the TLS, which was anonymous, and I only found out many years later from a common student, from a graduate student, that it was by Dorothy Thompson. And I think I always got on extremely well with Edward, and indeed with Dorothy. But the fact was that she thought I was attacking Edward, and she treated the book accordingly.
So did you suffer a lot of tension in that period because you?
I was never conscious of a lot of tension. I mean, it was all very. I wouldn't say gentlemanly. That would be a wrong word to apply, wouldn't it, to Marxists especially? But they were
rather gentlemanly.
They were all civilized, And I mean, I wasn't one of them, but then I wasn't one of the other people on the right. You see, I mean, it's not a tragedy, but it's rather unfortunate that Labour history is done by left-wingers and business history is done by right-wingers. If it were done the other way around, it would be really a great improvement.
I've never quite understood why there isn't a stronger Marxist economic history, because if you really believe that the economy matters so much, then you should, more than anyone, be analysing how the economy works, how businesses really work. But it isn't there.
That's right.
It's very strange, I think.
I think about Labour history and Labour historians in the same way as I think about women's history, that if you find an oppressed group or an oppressed class, the most important thing in their lives is the oppressors, and therefore you've got to know about, in Labour history, the most important thing is to know about the bosses.
Right.
You ought to know about business history, about corporations. In women's history, it's patriarchy, isn't it? And you need to know about the patriarchs.
That's right. Yes, I mean, that I was about to say was another unusual feature of your work in the 60s and 70s, that you did keep talking about the middle classes when almost nobody else was.
That's right.
Recently,
Yes.
we've been coming back to
Yes,
it, and people are
yes.
recognising
Yes,
that,
yes.
as you say, there are two sides, at least, to the class struggle.
And the great
you need to
irony
know
was that the people who were leaving out the middle class were the middle class, because
Yes, again.
nearly all these historians were middle class people, very well heeled, some of them.
But it took almost 20 years for the sequel to The Origins to
Yes.
appear.
Well,
the rise of in
you
1989.
know, I've already explained about the television and the AUT and the new university. A new university, you see, is quite something. I mean, you know, I was starting new courses and a new graduate course, the first master's degree in social history in the country in 1968. And there was a lot of work, you know, in a new university, a lot of administration. And great joke, of course, at that time was I'd come from a system in Manchester where the professors were the bosses and you were nobody, and you got kicked on the head, to a system in which everything was democratic and professors were nobodies and they got kicked on the bottom.
So you spent your life being kicked around.
That's
You
right,
would have
that's
us
how I see
believe.
it. And I did produce other books, you see. I got interested through the AUT. I was asked to do the history, key profession, which
Right.
again, you see, I mean, the universities are the creators of human capital, at least of the most expensive sort of human capital. And therefore, I saw university teachers as teaching the other professions, increasingly, because more and more of the professions, like accountancy and business management and so on, began to come into the universities where they hadn't been before. I also got, because it was a new university and because Lancaster was asked by OECD in Paris to do a study of a series of national studies on the new universities, I wrote a book on the new universities at that time. You know, there were a number of other things that I was up to in that period. And again, the Origins had been in the press for 2 years. I don't know why things are so slow, but then, to my horror, the Rise of Professional Society was also in the press for 2 years. So it was really finished in '67, which, given the other things I was doing, not '67, '87, given the other things I was doing, it was, you know, as quick as I could make it, generally.
I mean, given your interest in the social origins of what's happening in the
Yes.
economy and
Yes.
in politics, what role the professions played in Britain's economic decline? And what do you think of attempted social explanation?
Well, the main profession that's responsible for that is the profession of business management, isn't it? I mean, they can wriggle out of it all they like, but in fact, it's the people who manage the businesses, not only the private businesses, but the nationalised industries as well, and they are responsible. It's no to blame the workers or anybody else is like the Duke of Wellington blaming his troops. You know, I mean, you have to deal with the troops you've got.
Well, why have we found it so difficult to breed competent managers in this country?
I think it all
European
goes
countries.
back to the class system. You see, my approach to the Industrial Revolution began with the question, why did the Industrial Revolution happen at all, and why in Britain first? And my answer was because Britain had the right kind of society for it. It was an open society with great mobility, social emulation, people wanting to spend money or to invest money in order to better themselves and to rise, if possible, into the landed elite. Unfortunately, if you have a good society for one system, it may become a bad society for another. And it does seem to me that we are class-ridden. I mean, it's unfashionable to say so now. There are people trying to rewrite the 19th century and fillet it, I mean, to take class out of it, which seems to me to be, you know, perverse, to say the least. And it does seem to me that the main problem with British companies and British management is that it is still class-ridden. We have a low, Alan Fox says we have a system of low trust labour relations. Dahrendorf talks about a zero-sum game in which if the workers win something, the bosses lose and vice versa. And so instead of cooperating together like the Germans or the Japanese do to create new wealth, we spend most of our time frustrating each other and preventing improvements and so on. Now, this is a great exaggeration, I know, but nevertheless, that's the heart of the matter. It also seems to me that I call this the third social revolution. The first social revolution in history, it's in prehistory really, is the Neolithic Revolution, which because of settled agriculture, because you could create a surplus of food, you could have specialists, craftsmen, specialist rulers, specialist priests, you could have cities. This is where civilization began. The second social revolution is the Industrial Revolution. This enabled not just a small minority, but a majority to do other things than raise food. Right. And so you were able to have a tremendous manufacturing system and so on. Now, the third social revolution is the one we're going through at the moment. And that is the revolution, it's the professional revolution. Everybody's becoming a professional expert. So that even workers can become professionalized in the sense that their wages can become like salaries. And they can have pensions, and they can have holidays with pay, and they can have sick leave and all that kind of thing. Nevertheless, this is a society in which the top professions, if you're not very careful, can dominate the rest and exploit the rest. Now, you can see this most easily in Eastern Europe and in the USSR, in the old USSR. What happened there was that the nomenklatura, who were professional rulers and managers, exploited the rest, not necessarily in official salaries, in cash terms, but in better housing, in dachas in the country, in special cars, special schools for their children, special clinics, special shops. The thing that got me most of all when I visited Russia and talked to some of them was that they even had special hunting rights. I mean, this is back to the ancien regime, before the French Revolution.
But is it that one reason why the system has collapsed?
That is the reason. That's the reason, because eventually people get completely fed up. I mean, it's promises, promises. And the only people who get the promises fulfilled are the people at the top. Now, you may think that, we've won the Cold War, the West has won, and all this kind of thing. But if you look at the West, what a mess it's in.
I was about to say.
The equivalent here are, I call the state bureaucracy type Big Brother, for obvious reasons, for Orwellian reasons. This is a system in which Big Brother dominates and exploits the rest. The thing that may happen in the West, and is beginning to happen in the last 20 years, is the role of Big Sister. This is the big private corporation. Here, the managers are tempted in much the same way to overpay themselves. There's been this tremendous, almost explosion of
right.
chief executive officers.
Salaries, £6 million.
That's right. That's the kind of thing we're talking about, you see. And in America, it's even worse. People getting Stephen Wolf, getting United Airlines, getting $18 million. And although, people may say, well, what does it matter? You can't drive more than one car at once or live in more than one house at a time. But nevertheless, when at the very same time you have homeless on the streets and problems of violence and crime and rioting, these are the things that destroy societies. And it does seem to me that these are the two pathologies, the two breakdowns of modern professional society. So
the private enterprise is creating the same abuses in the
Indeed.
West that
yes.
public
and
enterprise
it's creating it sometimes in Western countries with the cooperation of the government. because the government is you know, the free marketeers have really let these people off the hook. It seems to me that there is no such thing as a free market. Markets always have to be regulated, and markets are rigged by whoever can rig them, and those are usually the people with the most property, as defined by the state. And so here are dangers to modern society, and this is the message I'm trying to get across.
So are you planning to write a third volume which will discuss these
I'm
issues?
writing a third volume which is called The Third Social Revolution, and it is professional society in an international perspective. I'm dealing with 6 or 7 countries, 7 if you count the 2 Germanys, since the war. And I'm
Which countries?
The countries are Britain, France, the 2 Germanys, America, Russia and Japan. Now, this is overambitious, I know, and but my problem is that if I don't do it, who will? So, you know, I feel it's so important that it shall be done. I think it's so important that people know not only the benefits of this new kind of society, but also the dysfunctions, the dangers of this society, and particularly of these 2 pathologies, these 2 exploiting elites which may develop.
Do you feel pessimistic about the future?
I never feel pessimistic. I think there are self-correcting mechanisms. The riot, you know, just back to Peterloo and the radicals of the Industrial Revolution period. Eventually, people have to make reforms in order to escape the very obvious dangers. And when you get riots in LA, when you get riots in Oxford and Bristol and Newcastle, you then know that there's something fundamentally wrong with the society and you must do something about it.
And fundamental problems in the whole world economy with
Indeed.
the famine in much of Africa.
Absolutely. And this is the globalization of this society, because just as the elites can exploit the rest in individual countries and in the most advanced countries, so in a way, with globalization, with the global economy, with the multinational corporations operating all around the world, they can do that in other countries too. And there are, you know, with the obvious dangers to the environment, with global warming and the erosion of the ozone layer, even when we do things which are supposed to be good, and we all hope will be good, you know, improving people's living standard, we may by default, by accident, create problems for the human race. But I'm still optimistic in the sense that human beings have made this world as it is. I mean, these 3 revolutions were not made by God or nature, they were made by people. And if people can do that, and they can make the problems, surely they can also learn to solve the problems. And I'm still, to that degree, optimistic.
Thank you very much indeed,
Yes.
Harold.